today we'll be talking about hypertension. Um, I will try and keep it as simple as possible and to take everyone along. If at any point in time anyone has a burning question, you just feel free to either drop that in the comments or stop me. I want it to be as interactive as possible so that we can all benefit. Um, Now, in respect to hypertension, it's a very, very important and very relevant condition because one, I can almost guarantee that of all of us on this program, 6 out of 10 of us will either already be hypertensive or would become hypertensive at some point.
Mm.
So most of us basically will have this condition. But it's good to set a background as to when we say hypertension, what are we talking about? Um, to be able to do that, we have to understand what blood pressure is. So, what is blood pressure? What do we mean when we talk about blood pressure? Because that's what hypertension revolves around. Um, I like to use an analogy of a water system. I'm sure we're very well more familiar with that. If we look at the water system, we've got a central point where it could be your tank, it could be your reservoir, whatever it is, that pumps the water out. And this water goes through pipes to different homes. If we use that analogy in the body, we could say the reservoir is the heart, which is in the center, and the pipes are blood vessels, which carry this blood to the different organs, which in this case will be the homes. Um, Now, to be able to ensure that this system works appropriately, you need to have a pressure in that pipe. If the pressure in your water pipe is too much, what happens is that you have a problem. Your pipe is going to burst. So also, if you look at it in terms of the body, the heart is the pump. The blood vessels are your pipes. The pressure in those pipes is what we refer to as blood pressure. So rather than water pressure, which is the pressure in the pipes that take water to our homes, blood pressure is the pressure of the blood that goes to the different organs in our body. So
Mm.
we can begin to understand that just the way pressure is very important in the water system, as such that any change in pressure affects water delivery to our homes as well as the proper functioning of the system. So also in the body, the pressure in which this blood is delivered to the different organs in our body is very important because that affects how that organ function and also the well-being of the system in general. Um, Again, what blood does is blood is the like we all know. I would say like most people will know in some form. Blood is what carries the life of an organism, carries our life. That's where our blood cells are, and our blood cells is what carries oxygen and carries food substances to the different cells. So without blood going to the different organs, the organs of course can't survive and they die off. So without blood going around our body, we will be dead. And that pressure of that blood is what blood pressure is all about.
Mm.
So that sets a basis for what blood pressure is. Um, so what is normal? This pressure of blood in our different uh, blood vessels, especially the ones that go to the organs, what's normal? Again, I try as much as possible to discourage people from looking at things in terms of blood pressure, in terms of what is normal and what's abnormal, but to look at it as a range and to look at it in terms of individuals. So, broadly, when we say someone has got normal blood pressure, we're looking at something between 90, 60. And in terms of blood pressure, there are two things you're looking at. You've got the upper bit, which is we call the systolic blood pressure, and the lower bit, which we call the diastolic. Now, what does this mean in simple language? We talked about a water system. With pressure, there's always a peak, which is when the pump pumps out the blood, the pressure increases, it reaches a peak, and then when the pump slows down, that pressure falls. That's typical of any system. So also for the heart, so also for the body. When the heart pumps out the blood, the pressure, because it's pushing out a blood into those vessels, the pressure is going to rise. So you have a peak, and then when the heart relaxes, that pressure is going to fall, and then you have the pressure fall. So that's why you've got two beats. The upper beats, or what we call the systolic blood pressure, is the pressure in the vessels when the heart is at its peak, when the heart is pumping. The lower one is the pressure in the vessel when the heart is relaxing. So the lowest is the lower bit, the highest is the upper bit, and in between you have a range. So 1960 is generally considered the lower limit of what's normal. Now, I must state that we're talking about an average adult, but even at that, it tends to be more individualized. What do I mean? If I see an 80-year-old with a blood pressure of 90/60, that's something that I wouldn't say is normal. But if I see a 21-year-old with a blood pressure of 90/60, that's fine. So we need to look at that in terms of certain individuals. But generally, for everyone, 90/60 is the lower limit of what we consider normal. And I use the term 130/35 as the upper limit. But like I said again, for me, in my practice, I tend not to allow people to be too fixated on the extremes. It's just a guide for us to be able to talk and work with. Now, 130/35, yes, is the upper limit, but between 130/85, sorry, and 140/90, which is a threshold which we'll talk about later, there's that gray area which most of us will consider normal, but it's that gray area which sometimes we refer to as being prehypertensive. And what that means is the blood pressure is beginning to rise, but it's not at that level where we should worry, but it's at that level where we need to take note, if I use that term. Now, this is generally for people between 18 years old and 80. Now, above 80, the thresholds increase because we'll see that later. The older we get, like if you have a pipe, over time, you tend to find out that the pipes that that water passes over time, those pipes are not as flexible as they were when they were first put in place, or when the system was first built, and that's why you need to replace the pipes from time to time. So also our bodies, the vessels in our bodies get old; they become less elastic. They don't open up and close as they used to. And because of that, naturally, that flexibility is lost, and that makes the blood pressure to rise. So if someone who's 80 has a blood pressure of 140/90, you're not really too worried. They're not hypertensive because you know that at certain age, the elastic nature of the blood vessels is lost. And so you tend to be more flexible in what you consider normal. So that's what we generally say is normal blood pressure. So what is hypertension? Generally, again, there's a threshold for defining hypertension, and that is systolic blood pressure, which is what we talked about as the blood pressure when the heart is pumping at its peak, of equal to or above 140 millimeters of mercury. And the diastolic, or the lower bit of blood pressure, which is when the heart is relaxing, of 90 millimeters of mercury or both. Now, it's important that either one of these being increased, meeting other criteria such as persistent. When we say persistent, you need to have at least 2 or 3 readings in different settings. That's when we say someone is hypertensive. Now, again, I must state that this is for an adult. For children, it's different, which we won't go into that. It's based on their age, and it's based on their height and weight. But again, we don't expect an increase in blood pressure in children. That's never considered normal. That's always something that needs to be investigated much aggressively. But generally, for anyone between 18 and 80, blood pressure above 140 and 90 is what we consider. 140 is systolic, or 90 diastolic is what we consider as hypertension. Uh, Again, someone might ask, we're talking about hypertension and blood pressure. How do I take my blood pressure? Or how is blood pressure taken? Now, yes, again, I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. There's so many machines out there that we can use to take blood pressure. But for the average population, the electronic machines are relatively, from research, accurate as well as easy to use. But there are certain basic principles we should be aware of in terms of how we take our blood pressure. One is the what we call the cuff, which is what we put around our arms. There are certain criteria that they need to meet if we're going to be able to take blood pressure the right way. And the one of those criteria, or the main criteria, is the arm circumference. Keeping it simple, the cuff for someone who is as slim as myself will be very different from someone who is 3 times my size. The reason is if that cuff isn't the right size, you will get a wrong reading because it will exert much more pressure on the arm than what it should. And because it reads a difference in pressure, when you have too much pressure because the cuff is too small, you have a falsely raised blood pressure reading. And when you have too little pressure because the cuff is too big, you have a falsely low blood pressure reading. So generally, we say the width, when we say the width of the cuff, meaning how wide the cuff is, should be at least 40% of the person's arm circumference. Again, in my clinic, what I tell my patients is, if you have a blood pressure cuff and you put it around your arm and you're struggling to fit it properly, then that cuff is not for you. If you have a blood pressure cuff and you put it around your arm and it's going across your arm more than 1.5 times, that blood pressure cuff is not for you. If you have a blood pressure cuff and you put it on your arm, and when you begin to take the blood pressure, the cuff begins to come off, then that cuff is not for you. So that's the simple logic in terms of the right blood pressure cuff. But in terms of going for specifics, we say generally the width should not be more than 40% of the arm circumference, which is usually the circumference referring to the midpoint of the arm. If you take a point between the bony prominences of the shoulder, what I mean by that, if you feel your shoulder, you'll feel some very bony parts. And then you look at your elbow. If you take a point midway between that, and then you take the measurement, the circumference of that part, meaning you go around it, 40% of it should be what the cuff should cover in terms of the width. And then the length should not be more than 80%. And what that means is, again, which is what I was trying to explain, when you look at the cuff, there's a part that inflates. That should cover generally most of the arm, but it shouldn't go beyond, it shouldn't overlap, and it shouldn't be less than 2/3 around your arm. So generally, if we use these basic principles, we will be taking blood pressure the right way. I've just got a very short video that just puts this in perspective so that people can just have a look at it and see it practically done. Let's see.
Aim to take your blood pressure at the same time each day. Just sit comfortably in a chair that supports your back and have a desk or a table in front of you. Keep your feet flat on the floor and don't cross your legs. Make sure you're wearing something loose enough to allow you to uncover your upper arm and that isn't too tight. Then take 5 minutes to sit and relax. Then rest your arm on the table so your forearm is about level with your heart. Stretch your arm out with the palm facing upwards. Then put on the blood pressure cuff with the bottom 1 inch above your elbow. The tubing or arrow mark should be in the center of the front of your arm. Now tighten the cuff so you can just fit in 2 fingertips. And make sure it is evenly tight at the top and the bottom. Now press start on the machine. Sit still and don't talk while the machine is working. You will feel the cuff inflate and deflate. Then write your measurements down with the date and the time. Wait a couple of minutes and take another measurement. If you find there's a big difference, wait a few more minutes and do it again.
Okay. So that's just a very easy demonstration of how to take blood pressure. Right. So next thing is who gets hypertension? Who? Sorry, one second. So who gets hypertension? Is it for a select few people, or why are we even talking about this? Now, around the world, the World Health Organization estimates that roughly about 1 in 5, 1 in 6 adults, that's people above 18 years, are hypertensive. So that's quite a very big figure. And the older we get, we are more likely to become hypertensive. So 1 in 5 people between 18 and 80 are hypertensive. But for people above 60, that figure jumps to 60%, which is why when I started, I say 6 in 10 of us, or most of us in this meeting, will either be hypertensive or will develop hypertension at some point in our lives if we live long enough. Now, the figure is a bit, not a bit, it's higher in England compared to the global average. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is, of course, the life expectancy is higher in England than many other countries. And secondly, lifestyle factors also contribute. And generally, 1 in 3 adults in England have hypertension. And that's statistics from the Blood Pressure UK Society. Not just that, 1 in 5 adults in the UK have what we call undiagnosed hypertension, meaning they've got hypertension because they've either never been tested or never been tested appropriately, do not know. And that's a more dangerous statistics than the overall prevalence of those who've got hypertension. Um, I hope everybody can hear me. Any burning questions so far?
No, we've got none at the moment. So
Okay.
please go ahead.
So, why is high blood pressure a problem? Why are we interested in hypertension? Why, if the blood pressure is raised, so what does it mean? Why are we talking about it? Now, half of all strokes and heart attacks can be directly linked to hypertension or high blood pressure. Now, that figures rise to about 2/3 when you talk about indirectly. When we mean indirectly, is uh, someone has problem with blood pressure, it causes maybe problems with the kidneys, which again now increases the risk of strokes. You can say the strokes came because they've got problems with your kidneys, but then if you were to look at the underlying factors, it was the high blood pressure that caused problems with the kidneys. Now, high blood pressure again is a risk factor for developing heart disease, and there's so many conditions we consider heart disease, things like heart attacks, for example, things like what we say angina or heart-related chest pains, things like even irregular heart rhythms. All of that can be traced to high blood pressure. Now, I still come back to the analogy of the water pump and the water system. If the pressure in the pipes is too much, the pipe will burst, and the pipe can burst anywhere. The pipe can burst in the kidneys, and there's not enough blood to the kidneys, and the kidneys can shut down. The pipe can burst in the brain, and that's a kind of stroke. The pipe can burst in the heart, or can get blocked in the heart or where the pump is, and that's a heart attack. So the pressure is very important in the water system as well as in the body. In the brain, for example, when you got repeated strokes, that causes death of the brain cells, and long term, that can lead to dementia, type of memory loss, which again, dementia and heart disease together account for about 30 to 40% of the causes of death in the UK. For those who are interested, I'm a health economist. So again, I always talk about the monetary aspect. For those who are interested in saving the NHS money, if you can get people's blood pressure under control, you will be saving the NHS £2.1 billion every year. And high blood pressure in itself is responsible for 75,000 deaths in the UK in 2015, and that number is about 100,000, 120,000 now. So every year, 100,000 people will die because of high blood pressure in the UK. So it is a serious condition, and we should be talking about it. Of course, as a GP, one in every 10 patients that comes to us is because of problems related to your blood pressure. But the bottom line and the silver line, and most importantly, is that this is one of the most preventable and treatable health conditions of all the so many health conditions. If we were to have a choice to say, oh, what one health condition would you like to have? Hypertension is the one you would want to call, because it's something which you can manage and it wouldn't necessarily cause any problems, and you can live 40, 50, 60 years after diagnosis of hypertension if you do the right things. Again, many of the other conditions out there, that's not the case. So what causes hypertension? Why do blood pressures begin to rise? Generally, we look at hypertension as two types. Again, I'll keep it simple. Primary is what most of us are going to get if we're going to become hypertensive. And that's when you have no underlying cause, but there are certain things we call risk factors that can increase our risks. And most, like I say, 9 out of 10 people who've got problems with high blood pressure will be because it's primary, meaning you do all the other tests, you rule out other things, and you don't find anything causing it. There's a small group of people who've got what we call secondary hypertension. Now, when we say secondary, because we are talking about pressure in the blood vessels, the body doesn't work in isolation. And so the blood vessels are sensitive to changes elsewhere in the body. And for example, the blood vessels are sensitive to certain hormones. If you are stressed, your blood pressure naturally will rise. And that's because the body releases stress hormones, which contracts the blood vessels and makes the blood pressure rise. There are certain conditions in which case the body begins to produce abnormally excessive forms of those hormones. And those can cause an increase in blood pressure. Again, not to bore you with the terms, but there are those conditions which we call endocrine or hormone-related conditions that can increase blood pressure. In which case, if you fix that particular problem, that's what will get the blood pressure under control. And so we say they're secondary because you wouldn't be treating the blood pressure primarily, you'd be treating what's leading to the blood pressure to rise. Also, people who've got certain types of kidney disease, some of which are genetic, such as cysts in the kidneys, multiple cysts in the kidneys, or polycystic kidneys, would have problems with blood pressure. Some people who've also got certain narrowing of the blood vessels from either from birth or from whatever reason can also have problems with blood pressure. Also, medications. There's so many medications that can cause blood pressure rises or hypertension, but those that are relevant are things like, again, for some people who've got, some usually younger people who've got ADHD, they're placed on certain medication called psychostimulants. Those can increase blood pressure and cause hypertension, and that's why their blood pressure needs to be monitored from time to time. But much more commonly in older people, it's more of recreational drug use, things like cocaine, things like marijuana. All of those tend to increase blood pressure. Now, we said primary means there's not one specific underlying cause, but you've got certain risk factors. And what are we talking about? What will make us more susceptible to developing hypertension? Age is a very important factor. Like I say, if we live long enough, 6 out of 10 of us will have hypertension at some point. And that's generally because the older we get, our blood vessels get narrower And because they get narrower, the pressure naturally rises. And beyond a particular level of pressure, you become hypertensive. So age is the biggest or one of the biggest risk factors for developing hypertension. But it doesn't act alone. There are other things. Women, for example, tend to be less prone to hypertension up to a particular age, and that's up to about 65. Again, above between 65 to 74, women's blood pressure tends to be much higher compared to their males who started at the same blood pressure at, let's say, 50. And the reason, there are a number of reasons. One of the common ones is estrogen, which is the female hormone, relaxes blood pressure, relaxes blood vessels and reduces blood pressure. And so when women go through the menopause, the levels of estrogen drops. And over time, 10 years after the levels of estrogen drops, their blood vessels tend to be as stiff or much stiffer than that of a male counterpart. So that's what explains why younger women are less prone to hypertension than older women. I must put a caveat though here. I'm trying to keep it simple. In pregnancy, there is a different dynamics that play out, and you can find that certain women get a form of hypertension in pregnancy, but that's something beyond our scope today. Ethnicity. Hypertension is much commoner in people who are of Black and Black Caribbean origin. Now, I will pause here to just say a few lines. It's not just that it's commoner. The blood pressure rises tend to be more sudden, tends to be more significant, and tends to also be more severe. And so Black people who are hypertensive are more prone to things like strokes and heart attacks than other races. Again, Black people who've got hypertension also have a type of hypertension that tends to react differently to the medications that of other races would respond to. And also Black people who've got hypertension tend to have blood pressures that tend to be very high or rise much more quickly than comparative when we compare them to other races. Now, there are so many reasons for this, which we wouldn't talk into that. But the key thing is, if you're a Black person or you've got Afro-Caribbean origins, you need to pay particular attention to your blood pressure. Genetics too, certain hypertension runs in families. So if you've got a mother or father who is hypertensive, you're more likely to be hypertensive. That risk increases by fourfold if you have a sibling who is hypertensive. So, of course, genes play a role in everything, especially with hypertension. Social deprivation, we tend to find that hypertension is much more common in poorer areas than in richer areas. Again, there's so many reasons we can look at that from. Lifestyle plays a key role, which we'll talk about later. Of course, poorer regions tend to be less active, less healthier, more drug abuse. I'll mention drugs being a risk factor for hypertension, more of social vices, less access to healthcare, all of which would lead to an increased risk of hypertension compared to much richer neighborhoods. Coexisting diabetes or renal or kidney disease also increases the risk. And so generally 40% of people who've got diabetes will be hypertensive. Now, that's a big figure compared to the general population. And how that happens is there's so many things. Diabetes, again, that's another thing on its own, can affect the kidneys. And I will mention that problems with the kidneys can push up the blood pressure. Also with diabetes, you tend to have lots of what I would term metabolites or oxidants in the blood that tend to damage the blood vessels. And as blood vessels get damaged, they tend to get stiffer. And as they get stiffer, of course, they're more liable to increase pressure and then hypertension. Other risk factors is smoking. Again, the nicotine as well as the caffeine content of tobacco thickens blood vessels, reduces blood vessel sensitivity, and increases the risk of hypertension. Alcohol too, for a variety of reasons, also increases blood pressure or leads to an increased risk of hypertension. But I must state that when we say alcohol, we're talking about excessive alcohol consumption. For religious reasons, many people don't take alcohol, which is okay. But if you must take alcohol, just make sure you keep it within reasonable limits. And reasonable limit is you shouldn't be having more than a glass of wine 5 times a week, or you shouldn't be having more than, if you have a bottle of a small bottle of 2% of beer, you shouldn't be having more than 5 to 7 bottles a week. And you should never take more than 2 or 3 bottles of alcohol at a time. That's a no-no. Another thing is obesity. When you begin to put on weight, you're not just putting on weight on the outside. Your body is also putting some of that weight, putting some of that fat on your blood vessels, and that makes them thicker, makes them narrower, and increases your risk of hypertension. Lack of physical activity, very, 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 very common cause. And the reason is exercise. When we exercise, our blood vessels relax. When we exercise, our body releases certain hormones that relaxes blood vessels. When you don't do physical activity, your blood vessels are less pliable, and then you tend to be more hypertensive. Anxiety and emotional stress, I touched on it earlier. When you're anxious, your body releases stress hormones, and all of that can lead to an increase in blood pressure. I haven't talked about all of this. What is it that I must do, you must do? We need to know our blood pressure. That's the starting point. How to know our blood pressure? For every adult over 40 in the UK, it's free to approach a pharmacy to know your blood pressure. If you're less than 40, you can also approach a pharmacy and they can direct you appropriately how to go about having your blood pressure measured. Again, usually I have what I tell my patients, and I say, if you're between 18 to 35, you should make sure you have your blood pressure checked at least once every 2 years. If you're between 35 to 50, make sure you have your blood pressure checked every year. And if you're above 50, I advise make sure you have your blood pressure checked every 6 months. And that's generally just to keep on top of things and to notice any rises in blood pressure. Now, on the NHS, there's what's called health checks for anyone above 40, 45. And part of a health check with your GP is that you have a blood pressure check. So for anyone who's above 40 who hasn't used that opportunity, please, please, please make sure you have a health check. And another thing is we need to be advocates. We've learned about blood pressure, we've learned about hypertension. We've seen what it is costing the NHS as well as costing us as individuals and as families. We need to tell someone else. We need to tell our brothers, our sisters to make sure they get their blood pressure checked. It is easy, it is not expensive, but then it saves so much money, so much heartaches, and so much lives. And so we must make sure that we tell everyone we meet, check your blood pressure. Have you checked your blood pressure? What's your blood pressure? What can I do if my blood pressure is raised? I check my blood pressure and it's raised. Now, your blood pressure being raised doesn't necessarily mean you're hypertensive. That needs to be confirmed. And a variety of ways we go about confirming that. Again, that's outside the scope of this. But generally, once your blood pressure is raised, get an appointment with your doctor. They will most likely ask you to do some bit of monitoring at home for a period of time, sometimes 4 days, sometimes 7 days, and then we can take it from there. Again, usually once blood pressure is raised, we want to do some urine tests and blood tests to look at other reasons. We also want to look at the heart. Blood pressure is raised, someone is hypertensive. How do I treat my blood pressure? How is hypertension treated? Now, for many people who detect, which is why early detection is important, they will fall into the criteria of what we call mild hypertension. And for mild hypertension, what we need to do is what we call lifestyle changes. And that lifestyle changes hinges on 5 main things. One is what we call the dietary approach to stopping hypertension. I'll touch on that very briefly. Exercise, what's considered normal exercise is at least, or we say it will be exercise. Exercise is enough for you to be panting, or exercise is enough for you to be slightly out of breath for 30 minutes a day. That's what's considered normal exercise. So when people tell me they've got a very active job, that's not exercise. You're being stressed. Your body is producing lots of stress hormones. Your body isn't exercising. So the fact that you've got a stressful job doesn't mean you're exercising. you need to have a dedicated time to exercise. And some people say, oh, I want to hit the gym to exercise. If you have been hitting the gym since you were 18 years old, then that's a good idea. But you're 45 and you're telling me you want to join the gym to exercise. For most people, I know that's not a feasible plan. And so what I tell them is, what is it that you can do or you've been doing and you'll be able to do when you're 60 or 70 if you're in good health? That's what you should do. For some people, it's walking their dog. But then instead of walking your dog down the street, why not take it a bit further? Why not walk your dog 2 miles every evening and come back? For some people, it's taking a walk around your garden. If you used to take a walk around your garden for 10 minutes, why not increase that to 30 minutes? For some people, if they've got treadmills, it's treadmills. For some people, it's swimming. If you used to swim for leisure once a week, why not increase that to 5 times a week? So exercise has to be realistic. It has to be feasible. It has to be individualized. It's not about hitting the gym or joining the gym or doing press-ups. It's about what you'll be able to do and sustain. Salt intake. Now, this is particularly important for Afro-Caribbeans. For Afro-Caribbeans, hypertension tends to be salt sensitive. And so the idea that most of us tend to add salt to a diet, that's a very wrong thing. You must make sure that your salt intake is just enough for you to taste, and any additional salt to cook meals must be discouraged. Alcohol, we've talked about that. Moderation of alcohol is very important. And weight loss, very, very important. If people could lose, for those who are overweight, if they could lose at least, not too much, if they could lose 5 kilograms for someone who's on average, has an average BMI between 30 to 35, you will be able to reduce your blood pressure by up to 3 to 5 milligrams. So if your blood pressure was 145, by just losing 5 kilograms, your blood pressure will get back to normal. So that's really, really important. Now, we mentioned diet, and this is what we call the dietary approach to stopping hypertension, or we call DASH. Again, I'll keep it simple. The basic rule is, if you look at this diagram, if you must have a plate in a week, of course, not a day, this is how it should look like. The vast majority of what you eat should be whole grains and fruits and vegetables. That should constitute the base of our meals. For many of us, that's the reverse. There's lots of milk, lots of cheesy things, lots of processed foods. That, again, is the wrong way to eat. So more of natural meals, whole grain meals should constitute the base, and then less of things like your fish, your meat, your eggs, and of course, your dairy product. No one is saying don't take them. Just make sure that they constitute a lower percentage of what your whole diet is compared to other things. The things you must avoid are things like your sweets, your chocolates in moderation. Again, everything is in moderation. But I don't advise anyone who is over 45, 50 to be having a bar of chocolate a day. That's a recipe for disaster. If you must have chocolate, it should be occasional rather than a daily. Again, I am assuming this is for the average person. If you're diabetic, these rules will be modified slightly. But generally, this is how you should eat. And for many people who are hypertensive, eating this kind of diet tends to take off about 4 to 5 millimeters of mercury of your blood pressure. And some people who you detected early, who do these steps, your blood pressure gets back to normal and you don't need to start them on any medication. For the other people who need to start medications, there's so many medications we can give. But I will not bore you with that. This is just for those who are interested. You've got all kinds of medications. For Black people, we start a different type compared to other races, and at different ages, we start different types of medication. But there's so many medications, and for most people, the medications, as long as they take it regularly, as long as they monitor things, keeps the blood pressure under control. And that's all you need to do. Just monitor things from time to time. Bloods maybe every year or every 6 months. Take your medication, and you're as good as nothing is happening or nothing is happening. In conclusion, if there's any message we must take home, it's that hypertension is an important condition that we can manage very easily and treat very easily if and only if we know we are hypertensive. And knowing our blood pressure and encouraging others to know their blood pressure is one of the most important public health duties of every one of us. And we must be public health advocates and blood pressure advocates as we leave this place. And just something to just brighten our day. It's there's something we call white coat hypertension. For some people, 1 in 3 people, 1 in 4 people, when they go to their doctors, their blood pressure jumps up. But so that's why the blood pressure you take at home is more important than what you take while you're in your doctors.